Today is Election Day 2024, and I'm not going to talk about today's election, but I am going to talk about my personal favorite election in American history, the election of 1800, in which Mr. Alexander Hamilton, unable to control his emotions and personal ambition, managed to ruin his own Federalist Party and place his political enemy, Thomas Jefferson, into the presidency. And of course, we'll also be mentioning the brilliance of Aaron Burr's Democratic Republicans in New York, also called Burrites. So let's get started. A few things we need to know before we talk about this election is that presidential elections were different in 1800 than they are today. There's been some evolution of how we elect our presidents from that time. So the first thing to know is that they did not run on a ticket of president and vice president. The candidates ran, and the candidate with the most electoral votes became president, and the second most votes became vice president. This is why sometimes during that time, we might have a Federalist in the presidency and a Democratic Republican in the vice presidency. They tried to not let that happen. What they tried to do was the electors, when casting their votes. So let me back up a little bit. At that time, people who could vote voted in their local election. So you voted for your state legislature. And that state legislature then selected the electors who went on to choose the president. They took electors much more seriously than we kind of take them today. Today is kind of a very confusing thing for us, the way the popular vote and the electoral vote works, but it was much clearer to them than what they were doing. So they voted for the electors for one man or another. And then those electors would vote twice, right? The electors voted one round to pick the president, and then a second round to pick the vice president. So let's say in the case of this election, the Democratic Republicans are Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. The electors would have got together. They would have voted all of their votes to Thomas Jefferson and then all of their votes -1 to Aaron Burr for the vice presidency. That is not what happened, but that is what should have happened. It didn't happen, though. We're going to talk about why. So that's kind of how they do it. So it's different from what we do today. So the election of 1800, who is running? Well, that's the first thing we need to talk about. Who is running? For the Federalist, incumbent President John Adams and also Charles Pinckney. Running for the Democratic Republicans, we have Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. So those are our four candidates for the election of 1800. Now, elections don't, exist in a vacuum. So there have been things going on in the years leading up to this election, which of course will affect how everyone's behaving in this election. And one of the things that has been happening is the ongoing dislike between President John Adams and former Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton. Adams and Hamilton have been at odds. They're the same party. They very much don't like each other, and John Adams has accused Alexander Hamilton of meddling in his presidency, which I'm not going to enter in on whether or not was true, but this is what John Adams accused Hamilton of doing. So Hamilton, although he is the leader of New York's Federalists and kind of the leader of the Northeastern Federalists, but definitely the New York Federalists, does not want John Adams to be president. He prefers Mr. Pinckney. So he wrote a pamphlet, and here's the pamphlet: Letter concerning the public conduct and character of John Adams, Esquire, President of the United States of America. And this is a big, thick pamphlet hit piece on John Adams, originally published anonymously, right? So nobody really knew Hamilton wrote this, and it was distributed mainly in the South. I think Pinckney was from North or South Carolina, in order to, whip up the vote for Pinckney over Adams. And the whole thing accuses John Adams of being mentally unstable, not as smart as people think he is, paranoid. It is a horrible piece of work. And later on, John Adams, of course, is going to refer to Hamilton as the bastard brat of a Scottish peddler for writing it. So it's a really terrible pamphlet. You would wonder, why would Alexander Hamilton do this to their own front-running candidate? It's because Hamilton has trouble managing his emotions and managing his ambitions. So he wants to stop John Adams from having another term in office. He would rather have a Federalist there that he can have more influence over. So that's why he writes this letter. This pamphlet was a big deal, as you can imagine, and no one knew who wrote it until some New Yorkers saw the pamphlet and read it and said, Hamilton wrote this. We know Hamilton wrote this. And a local printer in New York actually confronted Hamilton and said, is this your work? Hamilton said yes. As you can see, it was then published in New York with Hamilton's name on it. And Hamilton not only didn't deny he wrote it, he never apologized for anything he said in it. So this causes great division within the Federalists in New York, with some of Hamilton's longtime supporters and friends even writing articles about why would Hamilton even do this to John Adams, that this was a terrible thing to do. So now the Federalists themselves have begun to divide in anger over this pamphlet. Meanwhile, on the other side, the Democratic Republicans have been at work for the last couple of years, putting together what we would call modern political campaigning, meaning that people are going out on behalf of Thomas Jefferson, campaigning for him in areas where he might not get so strong of a vote. And one of the people doing that is former Senator Aaron Burr. And Burr goes on what we would consider to be like a modern political campaign throughout the northeastern states, and especially New England, where he had lots of support himself. He had big family roots in New England, was very popular in New England. Went all about on this big tour talking about Jefferson, and brilliantly brought his beautiful, educated, eloquent daughter, Theodosia, with him. And now Burr really starts turning people in the Northeast in favor of Democratic Republican Thomas Jefferson. And there are many people I know who believe that it was Aaron Burr who really brought Jefferson the presidency that year for his brilliant tactics, his brilliant campaign tour throughout the Northeast. And just as an aside, Theodosia met her future husband on that trip, Joseph Alston of South Carolina. So it was a very successful trip. Also, Burr's political faction in New York, they were called Burrites. So they were kind of a subset of Democratic Republicans, had been very smart in positioning themselves in New York as being the party of immigrants, of working people, of artisans, and positioning the Federalists as being the party of the landed elite and aristocracy. And one of the things they did was to open a bank that gave loans to all of these other people rather than Hamilton's Bank of New York, which only served the elite. This new bank, the Manhattan Company, served everyone. So say, for instance, you were a blacksmith and you wanted to enlarge your shop. Well, you had collateral in the equipment you already owned. You could go to the Manhattan Company, seek a loan, and they would give you the loan based on what you already owned. And so when it comes time for elections, who do you think all of these new voters are going to vote for? They, of course, are going to vote for the Burrites, the Democratic Republicans, because they have been proving themselves to be in favor of them. The Democratic Republicans also were against John Adams' Alien and Sedition Act because they said that it persecuted new people in America. And they also believed new people coming to America should be qualified to vote in New York sooner than they were. And I might refer some of you to the historian Nancy Eisenberg, who wrote a great biography of Burr called Fallen Founder, and her excellent article about the way today we have the roles reversed between Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr, that Hamilton truly was the elitist, and that Burr was actually the candidate who advocated for the people instead. So that's a really great article to read, in case you want to read that, by Nancy Eisenberg. So anyway, back to our story. So in the lead up to the election of 1800, New York has had local, city, and statewide elections, and the Democratic Republicans have virtually swept those elections, which now has the Federalists very nervous about this presidential election of 1800. Going into the election, Alexander Hamilton is extremely worried because of the Democratic Republican victories so far in New York. and he writes a letter to the governor, John Jay. And I'm going to read a little bit of that letter to you. Hold on, let me pull it up here. So he writes to Jay, "You have been informed of the loss of our elections in this city. It is also known that we have been unfortunate throughout Long Island and in Westchester. According to the returns hitherto, it is too probable that we lose our senator for this district. The moral certainty, therefore, is that there will be an anti-federal majority in the ensuing legislature, and the very high probability is that this will bring Jefferson into the chief magistracy, unless it be prevented by the measure which I shall now submit to your consideration, namely the immediate calling together of the existing legislature." Now, why does Hamilton want to call the existing legislature into session? He wants them to choose the electors now before the newly elected legislature, which will have that Democratic Republican majority, choose them. Governor Jay was horrified at this proposal, and his response, handwritten on the letter, was proposing a measure for party purposes, which I think it would not become me to adopt. So that is what Alexander Hamilton is up to before the election. So we have the Democratic Republicans now growing in popularity, right? Throughout the Northeast, which is generally a Federalist stronghold. You know, like just like today, we have regions of the country that we identify with different parties. So at that time, the southern states were identified with Democratic Republicans. The northeastern states, specifically New England, were hardcore Federalists, but those middle states, like Maryland to New York, New Jersey, Delaware, and there, Pennsylvania, could go either way. So the Democratic Republicans are becoming very popular, not only in those mid-Atlantic states, but also in the northeastern states. The Federalists are losing their hold that year. So Hamilton, you know, really creates a problem for the Federalists when he makes life even harder for them by publishing this pamphlet. Now, Jefferson and Madison were writing to each other about this pamphlet, and one wrote to the other saying that Mr. Hamilton has done more for the election of Thomas Jefferson than the Democratic Republicans could have ever hoped to achieve. And this turns out to be true, right? Because when the electoral votes are counted, John Adams finds himself in third place behind Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, who have tied. When the electoral votes were counted, now there were 138 electors, so 73 votes were needed to win. Jefferson won 9 states, 73 electoral votes, or 61% of the vote. Adams won 7 states, or 65 electoral votes, or 38.6% of the votes. Mr. Charles Pinckney got 64 electoral votes. So we have Jefferson at 73, Adams at 65, Pinckney at 64, and Burr also at 73. But Mrs. Q, you told us that the electors would do 2 rounds of votes, and the party would cast all their votes for the guy they wanted to be president, and 1 less for the person they wanted to be vice president. True, and that's what they usually did. But in 1800, some rogue Democratic Republican cast his vote both rounds. So Jefferson and Burr were tied in electoral votes. A shocker, right? Nobody expected that, least of all Mr. Jefferson and Mr. Burr. So now everybody's at work behind the scenes to try to affect what happens next. Well, we know what happens next, right? Congress has to vote for president, has to choose the president. And I can just say it's my own personal opinion that we should never, ever get to this position again where the Congress is in a position to pick the president. So the Congress is in Washington, D.C. Nobody wants to cast the tie-breaking vote, right? So they're voting over and over and over again, and neither Jefferson or Burr can get a majority to become president. I think they voted 35 times. And the New York newspapers had sequences of articles talking about how ridiculous the House of Representatives was, that they voted again and again and again and could achieve nothing. So people are not too happy with the House at that point. So they're voting over and over. Nobody wants to be that tie-breaking vote and then be blamed for whatever that president does in the future that no one likes. Politics never changes, trust me, always the same. So now there's other stuff going on behind the scenes while the House is making these like big 35 different votes. And one of the things that's happening is that within the Democratic Republican Party, there are factions. There is the Burr's faction, the Burrites, and in New York, there's another faction, the Clintonians, led by former governor of New York, George Clinton, and his nephew, future governor of New York, DeWitt Clinton. So the Clintons, knowing Jefferson's personality and that he can be a little insecure and paranoid, start planting rumors that Burr is going behind his back to try to get votes in the House for himself. This is not true. Burr did not do this. Well, you know, the Federalists have a little interest in pushing that story as well. So that story starts getting pushed about Burr. In the meantime, Burr is visited by a delegation of Democratic Republicans and Federalists in New York. He's in New York, and he's told, Burr, go to Washington, D.C. and advocate for yourself, and you will be president, as you are far more liked than Mr. Jefferson. If you go, you'll get the votes and you'll be president. One of Burr's biographies claims that Burr actually had his bag packed and ready to go, but his strong system of honor by which he lived told him that a gentleman never advocates for himself, that it was ungentlemanly and it would lower himself, and he didn't do it. So all of those people out there saying that Burr was advocating behind Thomas Jefferson's back, you are incorrect. Read a few biographies of Burr, read some of the letters going back and forth at that time, and you will see that Burr had the opportunity to do exactly that and was encouraged to do it, but he did not. So Burr stayed in New York, which he thought was the proper thing to do. In the meantime, Hamilton's not in New York. Mr. Hamilton is in Washington, D.C. And what is he doing? He's going behind the scenes to try to move votes for Jefferson because he so much hates Burr. Now, today, people will tell you that Hamilton hated Burr because, you know, of his, you know, bad personality. He was a schemer. He was all these awful things. No, Hamilton hated Burr because Burr had so brilliantly outwitted him politically in New York. And Hamilton just could not deal with it. Nothing to do with, you know, his morality or anything like that. I'll tell you, Aaron Burr never went out and had an affair on his wife and then wrote a pamphlet about it so everyone could know, okay? So let's just drop all that. The hatred of Alexander Hamilton toward Aaron Burr was based simply on Burr playing his own game better than he. That's all it is. So Hamilton is going behind the scenes, and before the final vote in the House, he gets someone to abstain from the vote. I think it was a vote from Delaware to abstain from the vote. This tipped the vote in Jefferson's favor, and Jefferson became president and Burr vice president, which is exactly what Jefferson and Burr had intended all along. So Hamilton really didn't hurt Burr here because that was the role Burr assumed he would have, would be vice president, and the role Jefferson assumed he would have, which would be president. All Hamilton did was hurt John Adams and pretty much destroy his leadership of the Federalist Party in America. And so after the election of 1800, Hamilton no longer has the political influence he had before that. So that's my favorite election, the election of 1800, some of the events that happened before it. And that is how Thomas Jefferson won his first presidency. So I hope you enjoyed that, and good luck to everybody today. Whoever you're voting for, I, wish you the best. And I'll see you again soon.